So, good morning. Appreciate everybody's coming and paying some attention to the fact that in spite of the fact that it's been a rough year on everybody this last year, and acknowledging the nearly 600,000 deaths from COVID over this last year, drug overdose deaths have also gone through the roof. We had a record year last year, 82,000 people. No, it's not the 600,000 of COVID, but that still is a catastrophic number. And we wanted to make sure that people understand the dangers that are here. So today, I'll talk just a little bit about what we're seeing here in Houston. We've got Eric Smith, the DEA Associate Special Agent in charge for the Houston region. We've got HPD Assistant Chief James Jones talking from the HPD law enforcement stand. And then Dr. David Peirce with the health perspective. I also have the manager of our seized drugs, or the part of the laboratory that analyzes these drugs. Houston, like everywhere else in the country, has seen a real issue with drugs over the last year. We've seen a dramatic increase in the number of cases that we see in the laboratory that contain fentanyl. 2019 dropped off just a little bit, and I think, well, there's the tablets that we're talking about here today. But 2020, we saw an 87% increase in the number of cases that contain fentanyl here in Houston. This is a terrifying trend, and particularly now that we're seeing, and this is what brought us here today, is this is the first time we have seen a material that is sold as ecstasy that contained methamphetamine and fentanyl in the same tablet. So you think about what that means. These are materials that are targeted at young folks, college-age kids, high school kids, thinking that it's ecstasy, and what they're getting is methamphetamine and fentanyl. So you've got probably a naive user there that does not know they're taking fentanyl, that's getting fentanyl. The fact that we could detect fentanyl in these tablets probably means that's a lethal dose in these tablets. So those little green cat tablets are the ones that had methamphetamine and fentanyl in them. It is certainly a part of a larger national trend, but also part of a larger trend here in Houston. 2019, we saw a little bit of a drop off in the number of cases of fentanyl, but last year it just came roaring back. I think there's all of us have questions why that is, but this is the reality of stuff. So just for the visual of it, if you think a baggie of ecstasy tablets, okay, these are children's vitamins and a couple of aspirin, but ecstasy tablets, things that are sold that look, colorful tablets, there is no earthly way that somebody knows what they just stuck in their mouth with this. Could be some random dude's toenail clippings in there, could be fentanyl, could be methamphetamine, could be anything other than what they thought. We see this all the time in these materials, that it is something other than what they thought it was. Your dealer doesn't know, you don't know. I can't stress enough cautioning, if you have a headache or you've got a pain or something and you ask a friend, do you have a Xanax or anything, your friend has no clue what's in that tablet unless you see it go into the little bottle, stapled into the little baggie at the licensed pharmacist. If you're borrowing a medication from somebody, you have no earthly way of knowing what's in there. And it could be the last thing you take. I think, like I said, we've got Dr. Peirce here that can talk about some of the dangers of fentanyl. What I will say is our personnel have been wearing N95 masks for several years now, because in the laboratory this stuff is dangerous enough. We keep Narcan around, multiple doses, of highly available for lab staff in case they're exposed, because this stuff is crazy dangerous. But James, if you want to talk to us a little bit more about some of the other stuff we see in the lab. So this is James Miller, the manager of our controlled substances section.
Good morning. I'm James Miller, the manager of the Houston Forensic Science Center Seized Drugs section. Nearly every day, the Houston Forensic Science Center receives tablets that appear to be legitimate pharmaceutical products that we receive for testing. These are some of the examples of the type of tablets that we received into the laboratory. The markings and the shape and the color of these tablets all look legitimate. Some of them are purported to be hydrocodone, oxycodone, the sedative Xanax, and even Adderall. However, when we test these tablets, we quite often find that they do not contain the ingredients that they appear to contain. Instead, they contain much more potent and dangerous drugs, like the examples that we have here. One of these tablets is supposed to be hydrocodone. One of them is supposed to be oxycodone. And one of them is supposed to be Xanax. But each one of these tablets was found to contain fentanyl. And as Dr. Stout mentioned, if there's enough fentanyl in that tablet for us to identify, that's potentially an overdose. And one of the things that makes this more frightening is the fact that the people who obtain these tablets from non-pharmaceutical sources think that they're actually getting the legitimate product, because to all intent purposes, it looks like it's supposed to look. It looks like the other tablets that they've taken in the past. But again, as Dr. Stout mentioned, when they do take them, they have completely unintended consequences and effects, potentially an overdose. In 2020, 40% of the identifications that we made in the laboratory were actually for methamphetamine. In fact, methamphetamine is the #1 drug that we identify now, surpassing even cocaine. More specifically, ecstasy tablets almost always contain methamphetamine, because the drug MDMA that most people think they're taking in ecstasy tablets is too difficult and too expensive to make, while methamphetamine is readily available. While other parts of the country have seen ecstasy tablets that contain fentanyl, this is the first time that our laboratory has actually made this identification. Take a look at the picture that we have here. All of these tablets came from the same sandwich baggie. Imagine that this is a dealer's bag. He's at a rave party. He's selling tablets to people who think that they're getting ecstasy tablets. He reaches into the bag and pulls one of the tablets out and sells it to someone. If you look at this picture, you see that the person who bought that tablet or who takes one of those tablets has a 50-50 chance of getting a fentanyl tablet and potentially overdosing. In fact, if this trend continues, you might be lucky to get a tablet that only contains methamphetamine. Because while methamphetamine, of course, has its own issues associated, you're less likely to die from a fentanyl overdose.
Good morning. My name is Eric Smith. I'm the Associate Special Agent in charge of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration Houston Division. I want to thank the Forensic Science Center for sounding the alarm this morning, and thank you to the members of the press and of the community for helping us to raise awareness on this issue. DEA stands with the Forensic Science Center and the Houston PD in the commitment to bring a whole-of-government approach to this public health and public safety crisis. That approach, in my view, is a three-pronged strategy that must be equally and aggressively pursued. Step number one is the reason why we're all here today, and that's education and prevention. We need to get this message out, particularly to our kids and to our kids' friends, in hopes that other parents don't have to bury their children. Step number two is rehabilitation and recovery. If you know someone who is suffering from addiction, please get them help. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, that's samhsa.gov. You can go to that email address or that website, samhsa.gov, and find a treatment center near you. There are 97 certified treatment centers in the state of Texas. 12 of those are right here in Houston. And step number three is law enforcement. You can rest assured that the Houston PD, the DEA, and our partners will not stop seeking out those who are getting rich off of death. For all of us in law enforcement, nothing is more important than the safety and the security of our community, particularly our children. DEA, Houston PD, and our other partners continually and relentlessly attack these illicit fentanyl supply chains at all levels. But again, education and prevention, rehabilitation and recovery, and aggressive law enforcement is what will ultimately make a difference and save lives. I want to perhaps in some sense repeat some of the statistics and underscore and capitalize on some of these numbers that should alarm all of us. The Houston Division Drug Enforcement Administration in fiscal year 2019 seized about 53 kilograms of fentanyl. In fiscal year 2020, that number increased 600% to 323 kilograms. At a fatal dosage unit, that's enough to kill half the population of the United States. So far in fiscal year 2021, which is the last 6 months, ending yesterday, the DEA here in Houston has seized 210 kilograms. So we're on track for a 420 kilogram seizure a year. That's enough to wipe out the other half of the United States. Kind of in going with this sampling that you see on the screen, the DEA Special Testing Lab in 2019 conducted an examination of some of the pills that were seized and found that at that time 1 in 4 contained a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. That's an extremely risky game of roulette. When every 4th person who consumes one of these pills could die, those are horrific consequences, and those are consequences that fall on people who don't deserve to die. As the doctor mentioned earlier, the CDC estimated that over 82,000 people died in the calendar year July 19 to July 2020 from fatal drug overdoses. More than 70% of those overdoses were related to opioids and to a large extent fentanyl. If you want to put that in perspective, the NRG Stadium seats 72,200 people. We could fill that venue with last year's victims. And finally, and this is very important for those of you who are civic-oriented and civic-minded, if you're inclined to get involved, you need to understand that the enforcement authority that classifies fentanyl-related substances, those analogs that are not pharmaceutical, that expires on May the 6th. That's a little over 30 days from now. We have to convince Congress to renew this authority, or these substances cannot be seized at the border. They can no longer be seized by law enforcement officials here in Houston. And what that means in practical terms is that China will then have more control over fentanyl-related substances than the United States. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for having us here today. My name is James Jones. I'm Assistant Chief with the Houston Police Department. And let me start by just kind of addressing the problem. What our lab discovered from pills that were seized by the Houston Police Department was that ecstasy tablets, that they were supposed to be ecstasy tablets that actually contained methamphetamine and fentanyl. This is the first we've seen it in our area. I'm sure it's out there in other parts of the country. This, as we've seen since I think at least 2017, fentanyl has been taking over. We're seeing it in all kinds of drugs that we're seizing. Ecstasy, the problem here today for us is ecstasy is a young adult teen drug that's abused by the younger crowd, and they don't know what they're getting. If they're getting fentanyl, they can end up dying, and because they think they're going to a party and have a good time, they end up with a fatal dose of fentanyl. The scope of the problem in Harris County, we've had 725 deaths in 2019 for overdose, 961 in 2020. That's a 32% increase. Fentanyl-related overdoses rose from 104 to 286 from 2019 to 2020. That's a 175% increase. Fentanyl and fentanyl analogs accounted for approximately 30% of all fatal overdoses in 2020. At least one type of opioid or opiate was found in approximately 55% of all fatal overdoses in Harris County in 2020. This problem is not going away, it's getting bigger and bigger. Our DEA partner just let us know that the problem may even be getting worse. So this is something we have to address, and we've been taking it seriously in the Houston area, and I know it's been hitting the East Coast faster and harder than actually it's hit Houston. We're actually it's just catching up to us. These pill presses, they're making these pills that are youth, our teens, or young adults and adults that are taking. They're pill presses. They can be bought cheaply online, and they do not have the quality of a lab. So what you're receiving is something that may look decent. What we showed earlier is probably a lower quality look, but some of these actually look very good. But there's no quality control in those. You have no idea what you're going to get. When they mix it, they don't know if it's going to have 1% or 0.1% of fentanyl or methamphetamine. So it's a lottery. You are playing Russian roulette. And we've seized these pill presses in garages, homes, strip centers, warehouses. So they're everywhere, and it's danger. I think education should be the key for us. We have to get out to people that taking these pills that they think are safe. They're not. You have no idea what you're getting. When you buy something at the store, you expect every package to be the same. When you get these from your local drug dealer, you have no idea what you're getting, and the overdose kind of speak to that. The Houston Police Department recognized this problem was coming our way, and we sought a grant. I think in 2019, we received it in 2020. So we've started an opioid-related overdose death squad. We have 2 sergeants and 2 officers assigned to that. We have a 2-pronged approach. The first goal of the squad was to make contact with non-fatal overdose victims and let them direct them to treatment. We saw the need that they needed treatment, and this wasn't trying to be punitive. We were trying to actually reach out and make sure they understand that there are resources available for them to seek help and get the help they need, because that's law enforcement. We're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. We have to educate people and make them realize there's help available, and it is a problem. So, and I think that's what we're trying to do. The second part of it is on fatal overdoses. We actually will go out and investigate those as if they're a homicide. Now, I gave you the numbers. The numbers are staggering because there's so many. So we can't possibly investigate all those. And some of those, we wouldn't be able to make a case on anyway. So we pick the ones that we can actually go after the person that sold the drug to the person the victim that overdosed. And we will seek charges. We've partnered up with the Harris County District Attorney's Office and the Federal District Attorney, and we've actually had some success. Since in 2021, we made 6 felony cases with charges accepted on 6 fatal overdoses. We've also identified 30 separate opioid dealers. So we are making a difference. It's just it's a drop in a bucket, but it's our attempt to actually address this problem, first with treatment. Education, I think, is a very important part of that, and enforcement is the third component for us. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Person. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the City of Houston. I'm going to leave my mask on because I'm the guy who tells everybody to wear their masks all the time. So bear with me a little bit. But I'd like to thank Dr. Stout and the Houston Forensic Science Center and the entire team for having this today and for all the hard work they've done. I'd also like to thank our colleagues from the DEA and the Houston Police Department, because basically they've said all the important things that need to be said. But let me add a couple of things. Let me first talk about fentanyl. Fentanyl is a narcotic. It's an opiate. It has all the same similar effects of any other narcotic. It is primarily a pain reliever. And so when people take morphine, which is given in the hospital, and other narcotics like oxycodone and so on, those are intended to be pain relievers. They're intended to do good for folks. The thing about fentanyl, which is also used in medical settings, is that it is extremely more potent, such that only tiny quantities will have the same effect as a larger quantity, say, of morphine or even heroin. And so perhaps this is why the drug dealers like it, because they, and I don't know, I'm not in that lane, but I would assume they only have to smuggle a smaller package to have the effect that a larger package would have otherwise. So maybe that's why they like it. But here's the problem that it creates, and this goes to something that Chief Jones said. The pharmacists, if you will, they're not pharmacists that are making these pills. These are criminals. They probably have next to zero quality control in their processing and manufacturing of these pills. And this is one of the reasons why, if you consider the fact that it takes just a tiny, and I'm talking, if we had a picture of it, enough to be lethal, it's a grain. It's a tiny little, smaller than a grain of sand, is enough fentanyl to have a potentially lethal impact. Am I right? That's right. And so now you've got some guy in a garage with a mortar and pestle and a bunch of stuff he bought at Home Depot, and he's making your pills? What are you doing buying it from this guy? All right, this is asking for trouble. There's zero quality control. So as has been already said, you have no idea what you're buying. And the problem is complicated by the fact now that the pill presses have gotten better, and so it's much more difficult. So the only person you should be buying any medication from, any pills from, is a true pharmacist at a recognized pharmacy. Never, ever buy a pill from some dude on the corner. Don't do that. There's zero quality control going in there. The other thing I wanted to tell people is and I'm going to get into law enforcement's lane here a little bit, but if you think you know of somebody who may be in this business, never go into where you think they're making the pills. Don't think you're going to be a sleuth detective and go take a peek in there and find out and then report it to police. Report to the police before, because here's the thing. If you go in there and you're in there snooping around and you kick up the fentanyl into the dust, because it is so finely ground and it can get in the air and you start breathing it, you may be waking up on the floor with the criminals asking you what you're doing in their lab. Or you may die. Do not enter a place where you think it is a lab for these folks. You agree? Call law enforcement first. This stuff is extremely potent. Tiny, 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 tiny little amounts of it can make you unconscious or cause you to stop breathing and die. And then the last thing I want to point out, and again, I'm piggybacking on what Chief Jones talked about, is that we have multiple private programs in place that we've gotten. So we've got a grant similar to what HPD is. It's from the CDC. It's called our Frontlines Grant. In fact, we partnered with a number of local agencies, including the Houston Police Department Narcotics Division, as well as Baylor College of Medicine, the University of Texas San Antonio, the Houston Recovery Center, and every hospital system in the region, so that when the Houston Fire Department picks up and transports an overdose patient, that we then are able to send folks, we notify the Houston Recovery Center, they will actually go to the hospital and hopefully be able to interview the patient and try to let them know what their opportunities are to get treatment. So drug addiction is an illness. Selling, manufacturing, distributing, those are crimes. So I want everyone to understand that we recognize that people have illnesses. We're trying to treat illnesses as illnesses, but the rest of it in the law enforcement lane is for law enforcement. And again, but just like that, my last comment is, if you think you know of somebody who may be producing or manufacturing, do not investigate on your own. Call the local law enforcement, call the DEA, call Houston Police, let them do it. It is extremely dangerous. The lab has already, Dr. Stout talked about how people in the lab have been wearing N95 masks since long before COVID-19, because they've already shown in their industry, they know how dangerous this is. Thank you.
All right, thanks, y'all. If there are questions, happy to answer any questions that may be out there for any of our folks. And thank you all for being here and helping try and impress the danger of this. Sinja?
Yeah, to answer your question, it's under the narcotics division. And it's just a start. I mean, it's in its infancy, so no, we don't have enough people. I mean, you know, that's just the way of life in the Houston Police Department. We don't have enough officers or sergeants to handle all of it, but we have started it, and it's a good way for us to identify the problem. And I think we got some dedicated people who really are passionate about it. So, 4, sir. 2 and 2. 2 officers and 2 sergeants.
For all the seizures that you make, is there a way to quantify like what you think the percentage of that is, what's still on the market out there?
You know, the unfortunate thing is what we see in the laboratory sits behind, that's what law enforcement has found, law enforcement has seized, what actually makes it to us, what is likely to get charged. So we're seeing really a small fraction of what's potentially out there. And I'm not sure I can even estimate how much there is. The fact that we see it is alarming enough, and the fact that we see it in the quantities that we're seeing it, like James was pointing out, 40% of what we get is meth. And then the opioids are down, most of the pharmaceuticals are about the number 4, right? Yeah, it's the number 4 percentage of what we see in the laboratory. And it's just off the wall. The amount of this stuff that's out there boggles the mind.
So are the, sorry, and sorry to
Mm.
but in terms of the fentanyl, that's a complex synthetic.
Yes.
It's a complex synthetic morphine. Obviously, it would take, some kind of complex lab to produce it, so is it smuggled in?
So probably DEA may be able to better answer some of that. Think of this, though, that heroin has to originally come from a plant source. Cocaine has to originally come from a plant source. So you've got all of the logistical supply chain from, like with heroin, largely stuff that's grown in the Far East, Afghanistan area, cocaine, largely grown in South America, and then the chemistry to get it to be finished cocaine or heroin. Meth and fentanyl, purely synthesized in a lab. Really? Okay, meth is easy. Fentanyl's not that complicated relative to other drugs. MDMA is a complicated synthetic pathway. Fentanyl's not that tough. So meth and fentanyl are cheap.
So that's why they seem to be stepped on with it.
Yeah. Y'all, DEA have anything to add on?
So the question as to its origin really has a two-part answer. Number one, the Mexican drug trafficking cartels have capitalized on the expanded opioid crisis in the United States over the last year or 2 years, and they see this as purely market share. If you think about what that means, and I mentioned this earlier, they're getting rich off of death. They see the victims that the doctor talked about, the addicts that the doctor talked about, and they see market share. They see profit, they see dollars. And so that's why the Mexican drug trafficking cartels, who previously were engaged with Chinese crime syndicates to get precursor chemicals for their methamphetamine labs, they can also get precursor chemicals for fentanyl. So a lot of the fentanyl pills that are being smuggled into the United States are being produced in laboratories in Mexico by the same drug trafficking cartels who are importing cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. But now they're getting rich off death. The second part of that answer as to its origin goes back to what the chief mentioned when he talked about pill presses. Pill presses are controlled by the Drug Enforcement Administration. You have to have a DEA registrant license to import one of those pill presses. But they can be ordered on the dark web, and they've been found here in Houston. And those are only designed, not for pharmaceutical purposes, but to press these MDMA pills, meth pills, fentanyl-laced pills. And that's completely done at a clandestine lab by folks who are educated off of Google. So I hope that answers your question.
With the line shot of fentanyl being smuggled in the United States and not manufactured locally.
That's correct. It is. And the numbers that I mentioned in terms of the staggering fentanyl seizures by the hundreds of kilograms, that's just the Houston division. We're one of 4 border divisions and one of 23 field divisions throughout the United States. So those numbers don't include what the El Paso division, the Phoenix division, and the San Diego division along our southwest border are capturing. That's just here.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds very alarming, but, we have 330 million people in this country. Like, if this drug, if you're only getting a tiny fraction of this drug that's getting slipped into the border, or through the border, whatever, then why aren't those numbers way higher? Like, what's happening here? There's just a history here that I don't know.
No, that's a good question, because you're right. I mean, it's not like we've got hundreds of millions of people dead from this stuff. From a toxicology standpoint, so toxicologist by training originally, when you have a drug abuser or a drug user that has become accustomed to opioids in particular. They can tolerate very high doses and still keep coming back for more. So you've got that population of accustomed users. They typically aren't the ones that die because they tolerate the amount of drug that they're getting, whether it's fentanyl, carfentanil, morphine, and there's an attractiveness to these higher potency drugs because they're seeing better dollar value for them. So that's probably part of it. I think part of it, and again, DEA, law enforcement may have a better handle on this than Lab Nerd, but is the strategy, the market strategy of just we flood the amount of drug coming across so that knowing that there's going to be some of this drug that's seized, knowing that they're going to have drug that gets lost, stolen by other cartels, all of these things, but they still have enough to supply the retail chain once it's over here. So there's probably some expectation of loss of material through the system, and the drug is cheap enough that they can afford to do that. So they can afford to send hundreds of kilograms through. If they can get 1 kilogram out to be able to step on that through their retail chain, they're good. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Is this a regional problem or is it across the nation?
This is all over the country. Texas and Houston have traditionally, over the last decades, had less of an opioid issue than other parts of the country. And I think this is part of what really concerns me here is this is here. And I think there is I won't say apathy, but I think there is a casualness about the concern because we've not really had an opioid issue here. People don't think opioids when they think a drug abuse problem in Texas, but this stuff's here. It's killing people here. The frequency of it is increasing here. We're seeing stuff like this here. This isn't off in Ohio Valley. This isn't something that's happening in Pennsylvania. It's here.
Why do you think those figures believe less use of it here compared to Pennsylvania or?
Chief, you might have a better perspective on that than I do. I just know that this area has had, and this is something that you see nationally, there's pockets of usage. Houston has a big PCP issue here. We've talked about that before, and that's unusual other places in the country. Users learn from other users. There's kind of a community effect of what are drugs that are preferred in regions. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. I don't know, either of you have any other perspectives on patterns?
Yeah, it's a tough question because it did originate in the East Coast. I think the drug of choice, I'd ask Lieutenant Casco, but I think is meth here. I think that's been one of the things that we've seen the most. So it's just what the region uses, and I think that changes over time. Cocaine is a big part of it, but I think to be able to cut cocaine and meth and put fentanyl, which is cheap, that's why we're seeing it more now here. And I can't. Consumer choice. I really don't know how to explain it, but it hit the East Coast much harder, much earlier than us.
Any other questions? Great. Well, again, I appreciate the attention on this. Please, please, please help everybody understand this stuff is here. It's crazy dangerous. This stuff kills people. Please be careful with it. I'd like to thank all our partners that are here. Appreciate your time and effort with this, and thank you for what you do.